Our next panel is an excellent panel. Are the English the problem? I think a very well put question. Anthony Barnett, founder of Open Democracy, has said Brexit was an expression of English nationalism, not Scottish, not Irish, English. I look forward to this discussion. I hope you do too. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm the chair of this session this afternoon. We have a fantastic lineup for you. We're pressed for time, so I'm not going to give a lot of biographical detail on each of them, but we have a group here of historians, writers, public intellectuals, all of whom in their different ways have been concerned with the question of England, England's place in the United Kingdom, in the European Union. And I suppose it's fair to say that in the last sort of 10 or so years, a number of academics, political scientists, think tanks, cultural commentators and others have been pointing to the emergence in England of a more distinctive and pressing political consciousness, a sense of the English emerging that is different from the identities and politics they'd had in the past, and in particular different from Britishness, a more self-conscious nature of England being expressed. And many would say that that found its culmination in the Brexit vote, that so far from being Brexit, this was actually England voting to leave the European Union, a full English Brexit, as somebody put it. And so what we want to do today is discuss this question. Was it England? What is the future of England if England is outside the European Union? What is English identity? Is England a monoculture politically, or is it just as divided as the rest of the United Kingdom, as well as with the United Kingdom? So those are some of the questions we're going to debate and discuss, and I'm going to ask Anthony Barnett, who's got a book coming out shortly, The Lure of Greatness, Brexit and Trump, somebody who's written a lot about England in recent years, to start us off by asking the question, well, was it England that did it?
Thanks, Nick. The Prime Minister, after the Brexit vote, said that the country had voted as one country to leave the European Union, and it would leave as one country, and that the precious union was her priority. But this means that when she described what happened in the referendum, she opened her analysis of it with a falsehood. Because while the same question was asked, the different countries of the United Kingdom gave very clearly different answers. And you can look at the United Kingdom, this is something I go on about, if I may plug my book shamelessly, which is due out next month, published by Unbound. You can look at the United Kingdom as a kind of lopsided pentagon. It consists of Scotland, which voted, as we've heard, by 62% to remain. There's Northern Ireland, which on a much smaller turnout, voted by, as we heard in the earlier panel, a very significant 58% majority to remain. The third of these units is London, which voted by nearly 20% majority to remain. The fourth element is Wales, which voted by the only one of these, the five units, which voted by a narrow margin of 5% to leave. And then there's England without London. And England without London voted 11% majority to leave. And that includes, if you include in that definition of England without London, the cities that are around London, Reading, Cambridge, Oxford, Brighton, and Liverpool, Manchester. So even including those great cities that voted to stay in the European Union, across every single region of England, most of it conservative, most of it in the south, it voted to leave. So we are looking at a national vote, and with Brexit, a nation spoke. And if, like me, you want to return to Europe, and if, like me, you're an English person born in England, is an English person, and wants to be a European as well, then the only road back to Europe is through England. It's through England facing up to itself as a country. And one of the great problems we have, and I would imagine there are many people here who were born in England, like Paul Mason wrote a piece about saying, I am an English person, but I don't want to be English. I might want to be British, but Britain is the problem. Britain is the integument within which England cannot find its own voice. Because it didn't have its own voice, it took it out on the EU. Scotland, which took its revenge on the way it had been governed on the Labour Party, voted comfortably to remain. And that's, if we want to get back to Europe, we have an English problem, and those of us who are English, have got to take our country back.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony. Suzanne Moore, you've written a lot about the need for people on the liberal, on left and progressive side of politics to understand England and the English. Do you agree with Anthony's characterisation?
Yeah. Yes, I share a lot of Anthony's analysis, and I think this is a kind of identity politics that the left has been embarrassed about in some ways. So Englishness could only manifest as a form of nostalgia and as something that only kind of the white working class could identify with. There's been an embarrassment about being English, and there's been a constant, and in all the Brexit discussions, there's a constant slippage between Englishness and Britishness, and some of that is just a colonial identity, I think. For instance, the discussion about the border in Ireland, people seem extremely ignorant about. They don't consider that England, I mean, as Anthony said, it was an English vote, and Scotland can go and do what it likes. But I think a lot of it did come from the Scottish referendum, when it was if England was saying to its subjects, are you able to have a mature democracy? No, Scotland, you can't. And yet, we cannot say to ourselves, can we have a mature democracy? And in a sense, if the union is to split, this will be a vote, I think, for English independence, possibly at the price of English dominance. And that's what May is trying to hold together. She's holding together the notion of Englishness and the notion of the union at the same time. And that may not be possible for her to continue.
Okay, thanks, Suzanne. I'm going to ask Robert Toombs. Robert, you're an acclaimed historian. You wrote a fantastic book, The English and Their History, timed very well, came out before the referendum. You advocated Brexit, in part, I think, because you saw it as an expression of some deep things in English history. Would you continue to believe that to be the case?
Yeah, I do to some extent. I think I'm perhaps a minority here, I don't know, in thinking that our choice was a positive one, and indeed an optimistic one, based on a rejection of declinism, which has been such a baleful part of our culture since the 1950s or 60s, a sense that we were perfectly capable of functioning as a country outside an EU that is undeniably dysfunctional. And I think there are, or at least one can find deep reasons for that choice. One can go back a long way into history. But it seems to me the danger of doing that is that it makes England seem exceptional and an aberration. Every country in Europe now has reason to be sceptical about the EU project, and many of them are more sceptical than England is. The difference is that England was able to vote, and it was partly able to vote because for us it was a fairly painless choice. Compared with a Greek vote, which would be an existential choice, it would threaten people's livelihoods, their savings, their careers, and so on. For us, it was an emotional choice, but it was not one that threatened our lives in the same way that it did or it would in other countries, because we're not in the euro. Also, I'd say England is not an aberration within the United Kingdom. In a sense, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but if there's any aberration, it's Scotland. Scotland is the only country in Western Europe that has such a high level of enthusiasm for the EU, the only country outside the Balkans, I think, the last time I looked at Eurobarometer. And the reasons are very obvious. The EU offers small countries like Scotland or Catalonia at least symbolic equality, and it's very attractive to nationalists. But I don't think we should, in a sense, put the two on a level and see somehow Scotland as being the European country and England as being the rebel. We expressed collectively a view that is very common in Europe. I think the diagnosis of the problems of the EU were very accurate. And I'm not sure there'll be an EU for us to go back to, and I'm quite sure it won't be one like the present form.
Thank you, Robert. Timothy, I want to ask you, Timothy Garton, I mean, I suppose it could be said that you carry the torch for a more liberal and pro-European account of the English and their role in the contemporary world. Would that be fair to say, that you think that it is possible to combine a sense of Englishness with a outward-facing, pro-European, more liberal disposition?
I think it's absolutely obviously possible. I mean, I've always defined myself as an English European, and those, for me, are my two strongest identities, along with others, Londoner, British citizen of the world. And I'm just coming back to what David Goodhart said, his famous dichotomy of anywhere people and somewhere people. I actually know very few purely anywhere people. There are some, but very few. I think there's a much more important distinction between people like me who are multiple somewhere people and just one somewhere people. And I think we need to be multiple somewhere people. And I think what we have to do is to reclaim England and Englishness and the flag of St. George from the English Defence League, the BNP, UKIP, and the football thugs. I mean, when you see the flag of St. George flying now, you think it's somebody like that. And actually, I don't need to tell this audience that what England has in its history is a fantastically rich heritage. It has John Milton, it has freeborn John Lilburn, it has John Stuart Mill, it has Gladstone, it has George Orwell, who's my St. George. And we have to reclaim that heritage of England and of Englishness and go out there and reoccupy that territory. But very importantly, not as an ethnic nationalism, but as a civic patriotism, as a part of a multiple identity. And I think, as does Anthony, that is part of the way we actually eventually take England back to Europe where it belongs.
Thank you. And finally, Alex, you're an historian. Robert argued that it was a rational choice for the English to leave the European Union. Others have said, actually, no, it wasn't. This was an expression of nostalgia, a sense of loss in the world, colonial and imperial. Empire 2.0, as a civil servant rather sarcastically put it. Is that, do you think that's at work or not?
Yes, I think Theresa May prefers global Britain, but actually global Britain and Empire 2.0 are heard as very synonymous in much of the world, of course, where Britain's global exploits in the past are not necessarily viewed as quite as majestically as perhaps they are here. I'm very interested in the way that, I study and write about empire and, in the ways in which that is so embedded in our national identity, particularly as the English, because although, in fact, Scottish people were, if anything, proportionally more prominent in the empire, and certainly if you look at Glasgow or Edinburgh, these are great cities that you can see were built with the wealth of empire. It's perfectly apparent. The Scots don't seem to have the same relation to that imperial history. They seem to have been able to put that more at arm's length for interesting and complicated reasons than perhaps the English have. And I think we still saw that during the referendum, these talking points of empire came up a lot. World War II, obviously, is rehearsed frequently as a metaphor, but also the empire. And there's a sense that one of the reasons we could go it alone is that, of course, we used to be in charge of everyone, so we can just go back. And then there's talk about things like, we could recreate something out of the Commonwealth, like perhaps an Anglosphere or Kansuk. And one of the best responses I saw to that, actually, I'm a dual national, I'm a New Zealander and a Brit, and one of the best responses I saw was saying, well, okay, you can have Kansuk, but we're headquartering it in Queenstown, in the South Island of New Zealand. I think perhaps if we had trouble getting on with the EU, if we're going to now move to the Commonwealth or something like that as a different kind of form of global power, then we have to understand that's also going to involve quite major compromises with nations who actually are our equals, not our inferiors.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Okay, I want to open it up to questions in a little bit, but Anthony, let me just ask you, what practically now would you do if you were a pro-European Englishman, as you described yourself to be? What is now the future for English politics of the kind that you would like to see? Practically what you should do?
Well, the first practical thing I would do is I would try to say to the Scots and the Welsh, please be independent, and to the Northern Irish, please join Ireland. And that then means that we don't need to form an English Parliament. We have a House of Commons. Then we'll get to work with the House of Lords. And England is a very decentralising, has very, very powerful democratic traditions, which I think are locked in this British logic. And I think we've got to confront this. And I'm very interested if I just say this point that Robert's made about declinism. I think that the country joined the European Union in part to deal with this idea of decline. This is a very powerful point. And what the ruling elite were doing, the establishment as it then was to try to manage their decline from being a global power with American persuasion and help to become part of the European Union. But I think that this sense of decline is attached to being British. If I could put this question, it's Britishness, the idea of the British Union, this unwritten with its uncodified constitution, its multinational entity, is incompatible in a sense with being part of the larger European Union. The European Union is a kind of constitutional project. It has great problems, has a profound lack of democracy. It does definitely need to reform. I agree entirely. It won't be, Europe in the future will not be the Europe that we have left. But it is a future-oriented project. And the British Union, with all this nostalgia, is a conservative, it's a past-oriented one. And this was the incompatibility. And it's the English trying to keep Britain, trying to keep Britishness, and that project is not compatible with being part of the European Union. And you can see in Theresa May's rigid, absolutely rigid determination, the Daily Mail, we must speak for England, brackets, by England, we mean the United Kingdom. Mm. It's that imposition, and there's one speech she gave in Scotland where she basically said, well, we are one people and we're going to become, under her rule, one nation. That force is the force which is taking us out of the EU, and I think that's also, so if I put this right, a lot of the impulse behind Brexit was an attempt to stop the decline of Britishness.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Timothy, come in.
I mean, first of all, to what Anthony and Alex said, we have the same problem as the Russians, the English, disentangling our national identity from the imperial identity, because they've been bundled up together for the last X hundred years. I don't think we should wait until the dismantlement of the United Kingdom, because that's going to be some time coming, even though if I were Scottish, I would vote for independence. And even when it comes, actually working out how you then structure England is quite complicated. Because when we last had to do that, it was the 17th century, you had cities and you had counties. Now you have what I call Londonia, which is London and 3 hours commuting time round London. The vast, I mean, I bet, how many people here, show of hands, how many people would be citizens of Londonia? There you are. Vivat Londonia, you see, vast, which would be a member of the European Union on its own. Then you have Wales, of course, you have to remember. Then you have Yorkshire, Cornwall, maybe the West Country, and other bits, but it's very unclear how you structure that. So if you wait for the constitutional moment, it's very difficult. I think we have to start fighting the intellectual and the cultural battle now by putting out more flags, the flag of St. George next to the European flag, by talking about England and Englishness and what it means politically and culturally and in terms of values before we get to the constitutional moment.
Thanks, Timothy. Robert, can I ask you, some historians, like Linda Coley in particular, have said, well, actually, yes, the decline of Britishness is real, and the response to that should be an English Parliament. There should be some national recognition of the English rather than, say, regional government, which is often where a lot of people go. They say, well, the English dominate the Union, 85% of the Union. They can't share. You can't have a federal United Kingdom when 85% is one nation, therefore you need to go to the regions. And others will say, well, actually, those regions are artificial constructs. They're technocratic government office constructs. Do you think we should, is there a way of English identity being expressed politically?
Churchill was the one who suggested that in about 1911. It wasn't very popular then. I don't think it would be very popular now. I think in a way England has shown it's quite willing to leave the UK. I don't believe that England is desperately trying to hang on to Scotland, Wales and Ireland. If it had been, it would have voted to remain. I think the answer, at least I think the first step that one could try is Devo Max. That would be practically home rule for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I would take a relatively modest first step of trying English votes for English laws or an English Grand Committee, which was also suggested first before the First World War, when we really seriously discuss this for the last time. And I think at least it's worth trying to see if that is what people want. People don't, I think, want regional governments. They don't really want a separate English Parliament. I think that's fairly clear. But they do want the sense that England is not despised. I mean, there is this perhaps slightly paranoid sense that everybody hates England, everybody's ashamed to be English, the Scots and the Irish don't like us, the French don't like us, and so on. Why doesn't somebody allow us to be ourselves? I think it's a fairly modest desire. I don't think it's really nationalism in the sense that we usually understand that word. And I think and hope it might be satisfied by fairly modest political changes.
Suzanne, can I ask you, Anthony mentioned Paul Mason's pieces. You talked about the sort of class snobbery in thinking of the flag of St. George looking as a sort of working class phenomenon that people on the, would look down upon. But people like Paul Mason argue, actually, look, an English national project will inevitably be dominated by, the Southern English conservative, economic power elites, and that you're doomed if you think you can make something else of England because of the kind of weight of power that exists in conservative southern England.
Well, I'm not sure, because I think both the left and the right are completely mired in nostalgia in their view of Englishness, and that's why we've ceded so much to the right by saying, let's repress this vile thing, it could be racist. In fact, to talk about belonging or a sense of place, these are just things that we have to talk about and detach from ethnicity, which we can do. I mean, we can form, as Timothy said, a sort of multiple identities, and they don't have to be based on race or class. So I would like to see a kind of version of English modernity. And I know there's a sort of mystical kind of tradition of Englishness, alternative tradition of William Blake and, Albion and stuff. And that does speak to certain people, and we've had a little go at that, and Billy Bragg did his English, half English thing. But Englishness has to be a kind of choice, and it has to be a modern choice, the choice that modern people would make, if you like, and a sophisticated choice. People who are anti-English and say, oh, I'm not English, I'm British and I'm European, often think to be English is unsophisticated. And so I do think there's a class element there, and that's where you just get the sneering at the flags. I'm not a fan of the flags, but I mean, look, David Bowie died last year. I mean, we were in mourning for this English person, and David Bowie was not Scottish or Irish, he was English. And we have so many cultural symbols. Grime couldn't come from anywhere else but here. You know what I mean? Like, there are loads and loads and loads of things where we can see an English identity, a cultural identity that is not something to do with the war that exists now. So I think that's been the problem for Corbyn's Labour, is that they have no vision of what a modern Britain or a modern England might look like. So that's where I would be interested to go.
Well, final one then.
I agree.
Alex, on this, New Zealand and Australia, after Britain joined the European Community in 1973, had to find a new place in the world outside of the Sterling area and what had been the if you like, the sort of settler Commonwealth. Is it possible for Britain to fight, if it's not going to glorify in the imperial part, if it's not going to dress itself up as a sort of global Britain, which means many different things to people overseas than it does perhaps to the people who utter those things in London? What is it going to be? What is the place in the world of the English?
Golly, if I had the answer to that, I'd run for Parliament. I think it's. I think that is the big challenge, is finding that identity, and it's difficult because the notion of empire is actually so involved in Britishness. I was saying just before we went on stage that, in fact, the British Empire actually predates Britain. The term British Empire was actually first said by Queen Elizabeth I's court magician John Dee in the late 16th century, and of course Britain didn't come into existence until the early 18th century, so in fact it predates it quite substantially. So I think we're possibly unique in that respect as being a nation that is actually so formed with the idea of an empire and an international kind of reach in that way. It's, I think, very hard then to extract it, and perhaps that's one of the reasons, the things Suzanne said, that we kind of, when we look at Englishness, we reach back to almost medieval ideas sometimes, the sort of folklore and so on, is possibly because that's been something that's been neglected. We don't know what else we're reaching for, and of course there are more modern things in David Bowie and so on, but it's somehow lacked a kind of coherence as an English identity there, I think, and it's a huge challenge how you would do that. or a British identity. I mean, I haven't completely given up hope that we could save the Union, although I think some others possibly have. But, you know, this identity does need to be in some way forged and fought for, because at the moment I think it is quite vague.
Okay, let's open it up to some discussion and debate then. I think we have microphones, and if we don't, just shout very loud. Can people put their hands up? I'm going to take about 4 questions in one go, so that we get a chance to get people in as we're running over time. Yeah, microphone here. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. John Bryant, self-processed Liberal Democrat. Isn't the problem we have with British politicians generally that they don't understand the difference between nationalism and patriotism, and therefore they avoid the debate completely? Whereas other countries, they are patriotic, they support their own people in football tournaments or whatever, but they also recognise the patriotism in others and respect it. Okay. Do we want to have respectful patriotism in England, which actually acknowledges the multitude of different diversities we have here, but not a nationalism?
Okay.
That's the thing that is more dangerous.
Okay, thanks so much. Next question.
Yes, my name's Steve Freeman. I want to just say I agree a lot with what Anthony said about the idea. I don't see myself as British. I completely reject the idea of British. I see myself as being English. But I think we've got a great tradition in this country, a democratic tradition, a revolutionary tradition that goes back to the English Civil War, and that tradition is forgotten. It's worth remembering that this country abolished the monarchy in the House of Lords in 1649, and it only took them a month to do it. And we have a great tradition going back to those times, right the way through the Levellers and the Chartists and the suffragettes. One of the most revolutionary things England could do would be to abolish the 1707 Act of Union and allow Scotland to decide where it wanted to be in the European Union or not, given that they voted for it. So my question is this. I just say I think there are two. I just say this point. I think there are two ideas about England. There's an Anglo-British idea, which does fly the flag of St. George. I completely reject the idea of the flag of St. George. All right? And I think there's this other democratic England that's waiting to get out. So my question would be this, and it goes back to an old nursery rhyme, which was, Britain is like Humpty Dumpty, sat on a wall, had a great fall. So my question is, can all the king's horses and all the king's men put Humpty back together again after Brexit?
Right, okay, thank you. I wasn't sure whether is Humpty England or Britain. I wasn't quite sure. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Come on, next one.
There's a question. Woman over
Sorry, I'm sorry, I couldn't see you there. Yeah.
That's all right. I would just like to ask why on earth at this moment in time are you looking at nurturing this little creature called England? I find it quite nauseating. At the moment, we're looking at breaking away from Europe, which has been seen as beneficial in bringing people together, in collective cooperation, about reducing conflict, and now we want to nurture this little thing called England with a flag. I actually ask why, at this moment in time, is that identity seen so as important?
Okay, thank you. And one behind you. Yep.
Perhaps not unrelated to that, but slightly less loaded question, and perhaps given that the UK entered the European Union as a single entity, how would reconnecting with English identity help us reconnect with the European Union? I'm not quite clear on that either.
So once we leave the European Union, how would England reconnect with it?
I said reconnect, so I'm not assuming we necessarily leave it as a formal, sort of whether rejoin it politically or, to forge that connection.
Okay.
Keep alive those connections.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. Let's go here.
This is directed in particular historians on this panel. From my reading of, English history, I've got the impression that from the later Middle Ages onwards, England has taken a very different path of development from both the continental nations and the nations on the Celtic fringe. So I would like to ask, do you think England has taken a very different path of development from the continent and the Celtic nations? And even if this is not the case, has this had an effect on the decisions regarding Brexit and all the constituent parts of the United Kingdom?
Okay, thank you. Over here, one more.
Oh, hiya. I'd like to ask about multiculturalism. Because nationalism has always been a bit of a problem for the left, and the one way that the New Labour dealt with that was by talking about multicultural Britain. I'd be to know what you think of that strategy. So how we got from the 2012 Olympics, perhaps the ultimate expression of that, to where we are today.
Okay, great. Can people who've still got questions just hang on, and let's take this round and ask our panel just to dip into those questions where they see appropriate. I'll start with you, Timothy.
Yeah, why to nourish this little thingy called England? Because this little thingy called England is there anywhere, and it's there in this rather nasty form, as I think many of us were trying to say. That's to say, it's pretending to be Britain, but is actually England, and a very particular ethnic, nationalist, anti-European idea of England. And then it says global Britain, but it's still that idea of England underneath. It's the flag of St. George is the EDL and the BNP and UKIP. So the choice is not there. Just let's not talk about England, let's just talk about Britain. The question is, do we take on the contest about the meaning of England? That's a challenge for us. And it's never going to be decided in the shape of one new, wonderful, liberal, modern England. It will always be a contested contest. But the question is, do we take on the fight, or do we let it go by default?
Okay. Alex?
Well, I completely agree with that. I would just like to add to it, obviously, from the perspective of banging the drum of the empire, that actually I think it's very hard to do that if we're not going to face up to our imperial history and to the fact that, in 2014, a survey was done by, I think, maybe YouGov or somebody like that, in which 59% of people said that the empire was something to be proud of. We don't teach it in schools. I think that possibly explains that sort of figure. And I think if we don't engage with that, we're going to have real trouble defining ourselves and re-engaging with the rest of the world.
Okay, Robert, are there radical traditions on which we can draw, or is that a sort of Bennite fantasy? We're going to start talking about the levellers again.
Well, there are all sorts of traditions on which we can draw, but I'd like to answer another question, if I might. Interesting though that one was. Why this little thing called England? Because nations are the indispensable foundations of democracy. That's my simple answer to that. English development, different from that of Europe? Well, all countries have different paths of development. I think the thing that is most relevant to our choice is that we have a very different experience of the 20th century. And therefore, we don't feel constrained to be part of an EU, which for many people is what defends them against war, civil war, dictatorship, and so on. We haven't that experience, and we haven't that constraint. I would say that illusion, in fact. This is a political choice. It's not just about identity. It's not a psychological matter. It's a matter of politics. We shouldn't forget that.
Okay. Anthony and Suzanne, any comments on the questions, or shall I bring people in? Go on.
Yeah, no, I've got one. I would like to address the applause for the lady who said, why are we bringing this little England in? And it's not just the point that nations are indispensable for the articulation, the expression of democracy. It's that if you're an Italian, or if we've seen with Macron, you can be French, you can express your love of France and your love of Europe at the same time. They don't say, what is this little country called France, or a little country called Germany? It's a natural part of a complex and multiple identity. And the English have, if you like, what has now become a problem from having inherited a privilege, and the privilege was being the first nation, the first industrial nation, and whether from the American Revolution or the French or from the Chinese or the Germans, they gained their independence, they gained their presence in the modern world by fighting an English world, and they had to fight as themselves, and we English didn't have to. They were trying to become like us, and so the English have a tradition that we don't need all this nationalism. But this is an expression of Englishness, if you look at it from the rest of the world. And so what you think of as something which is becoming small, right, and rather horrid, actually is a way of becoming normal.
Okay. Suzanne?
Yeah, I just carry on from that, really. I think if you don't address this stuff, we're kind of unanchored at the moment. We have no moorings. So what you get, and you get in certainly in Theresa May's discourse, is this turbocharged English exceptionalism, that we can do whatever we like. Europe will have to bow down before us. And it's this strange kind of contradiction between, oh, England, the tiny little thing that we don't really like to speak about, and hey, we can take on the rest of the world. There is no reality. This is a sort of fantasy going on. And I think so to really address what Englishness is, breaks the fantasy and is probably pretty uncomfortable. But that's what we have to do, yeah.
Okay, so we're really up against time, so I really want just to let the people who've been waiting very patiently here to make it 30 seconds, please.
One of the issues I have is that the historical notion of Britishness and Englishness I find a very male notion, and as a woman it does not speak to me at all, and I think one of the reasons that Europeanism is much more speaking to me is that it's much more inclusive. Do the panel have a version of Englishness, Britishness that can actually speak to everybody in this country rather than just to the white males?
Hi. At the beginning of this panel session, it was pointed out that the Welsh voted 5% in favour of Brexit. So I was wondering whether it might be possible to expand this, or just to touch upon the context, the Welsh context for this conversation in terms of Welsh identity, and whether the Welsh also feel that they're living a sort of fantastical idea of their own nationalism and their own strength. Whether any, in fact, of the comments that have been made on this panel do apply to the Welsh on the basis that they also did vote in favour of Brexit.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very good question. And then Hilary, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Sorry, I didn't. You stood up when I didn't see you. Yes, sorry, Hilary. Just 1 second. Yeah.
So you mentioned that there was the sort of the England and then also London, and where the vote stood if you took London out. I live in London, but I use European money to work with vulnerable communities in the north of England. And you're absolutely right, there is a split. But I'm wondering how that split has come about. And when we're saying, is England the problem, is London somewhere the problem in here also? Okay. Because there is disparity in London, there is segregation, there is, but for some reason we seem to take that out of the argument.
Okay, is London the problem? Okay, then Hilary, and then one more, then that's it, I'm afraid.
So
yeah, Hilary.
I'm a Yorkshire European working in Amsterdam and living in Hackney, and I want to ask really about whether there's any role for local government thinking anew and acting anew now in the present. Anthony talked about the democratic traditions, deep democratic traditions in different localities, locked inside this union, as well as the Scotland and Wales. And I'm just thinking, if you take Catalonia, there the sort of civic radical consciousness is led by a local authority that's taking radical action. Obviously, we're limited because of the Tory onslaught, but you have got councils like Preston using public procurement, or you could have Leeds resisting housing policy. I mean, there are all sorts of options. And could this help with councils working with civic activists to unlock this radical tradition? So we had a kind of remaking of Englishness from below, just as the Alliance of Fearless Cities in Europe is remaking Europe from below. Okay.
Very good question.
Will you squeeze me in if I take 20 seconds?
Yes, I will.
I'm appalled by this. My name is Bruce Nixon. My book's outside. I'm appalled by my one-day experience of this conference by the fact we do not talk about the way we are destroying the habitat. We're destroying all life on the planet. That is our most serious problem, and it is the most strongest reasons for being in Europe, because we have to enjoy a level playing field with our allies in Europe. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we have 5 minutes, so a minute each from our panel on any question they want to respond to, starting this time with Suzanne.
Well, I obviously have sympathy with the person who said that Englishness can appear the property of white men only. Again, I would say it is what we make it. When we saw people debating their civic identity in Scotland, that certainly wasn't only a male-only conversation. People were engaged, young people were engaged. That was one of the keys to that level of debate, I think, that 16-year-olds could be involved. So I think Englishness is what we choose it to be. I certainly don't want it to be the property of sort of people who are just interested in wars and the military. I think it's a lot more. There's a lot more there.
Yes, I want to reinforce the point that Suzanne made. I think the thing of the nationalism, which is male, is great British nationalism, with its highly centralised organisation, its imperial nostalgia, and the women leaders that it's had take on a male form, as we're now experiencing with this election. And I think the point about ridding ourselves of this, as we've just seen in Scotland, is that if you had an English culture, its energy would be a decentralizing energy. The energy of the British Union is a centralizing. Westminster is a centralizing, massively centralizing culture, financially and politically and organizationally, and in terms of its kind of sexuality, its gender. But a decentralizing England would, I think, pick up the energies that Hillary has just talked about.
Okay. Robert.
Well, I think we do need, if we could manage to do it, a much more decentralized form of governance. But we've had now 70 years of super centralization ever since the Second World War. And the fact that we are so sensitive to the idea of postcode lotteries shows how, it seems to me, how addicted we've become to the idea of centralization and uniformity. We have to get away from that if we want real decentralization and real local democracy. And I hope we will, but I think it will be rather a long haul.
Alex?
I'm sorry also to pick up on the identity and masculinity question, but it was a really good question. I think there absolutely is a way in which you can have, I mean, some of us have no choice. We have multicultural identities, I do, and I'm sure many people here do. So, you're in multiculturalism whether you like it or not. But I think there is a way of having an identity that is different, and the way that we do that is London. I mean, London gets a lot of stick, but certainly where I live in the East End, it's remarkably diverse racially, in terms of class, and, ethnically, linguistically, religiously. And actually, it gets on pretty well. It works quite well, and all those people consider themselves Londoners. So if that is possible, then I do think a more inclusive civic Englishness is also possible, but it is going to take work and vision.
I would say, if you're liberal, cosmopolitan, pro-European, please don't give up on England and Englishness. Don't leave it to the male chauvinist, white reactionaries, because it's that English, particularly English version of Britishness, which is leading us to disaster through Brexit. I mean, you cannot imagine how the absurd self-delusion of those who are governing us at the moment, the idea that in one bound William is free, that we will now be global Britain, bestriding the world stage, making fantastic free trade deals, being recognized as a world power. This is simply laughed at in the rest of the continent. In people talking to each other, French, Germans, Poles, simply laugh at it. But if you want to go up against that utterly delusional English version of Britishness, then you have to fight the good fight of offering a different version, more liberal, more open, more European version of what it means to be English. And nothing against the flag of St. George. Put out more flags, I say.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. We didn't answer your question on Wales, and we should. Wales and the Welsh are an important part of this debate, and maybe another time we'll be able to do that. And perhaps also, as the Brexit negotiations unfold, the cities and the counties and the new metro mayors of England will find an English voice to contribute to the debate on Europe, and not just allow it to be expressed through Westminster and Whitehall, where we are now. But thank you very much to our panel for a really interesting discussion. Lots of different opinions and aspects on this one. We'll go on and on. Thank you very much.